I am the Lord of truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
What does it mean Messiah matters?
It means apart from him we can do nothing. It means he is the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeshua is the only way of salvation. He is everything. We have to have the Tanakh to know the Messiah.
But we have to have the Messiah to know the Tanakh. Without Messiah, we have nothing.
Basically, it's all about the Messiah. It's Wednesday, February 28th, 2018. This is Messiah Matters number 208. Disturbing the peace in North Tacoma for 36 years. My name is Caleb Haig. And from a place meaning children of the sun, yet wishing there was more of it right now, Rob Van Hoff. What up, Rob? How's it going, man?
Hola.
How's it going?
I'm happy.
Good. I have a whole new light set up in here.
Yeah, it looks you look more professional. I look
Thanks.
less professional.
Well, you know, Mr. Steve, as my children call him, has been in town, and so he recorded the staff of TorahResource, each one of us giving our testimony, how we came to the Messiah, and then how we came to Torah. And so I took down my whole light thing, and I got some good ideas from him as he was shooting it. And so I tried to recreate some of what he did. It doesn't look nearly as nice as what he did, but it's, you know, it is what it is. Yeah. All right. How you been, man? Happy Purim. Happy Purim.
Happy Purim.
For those who don't know, Purim is tonight.
Not too far from Passover now, too.
That's right. It is going to be a joyous festival tonight. It is the story of Esther, right?
That's right.
So good times will be had by all. I suppose we probably should do more on Purim, but, you know, it's just not really, you know, it is what it is. They tried to kill us. God intervened. We won. Party.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out if my mic's too hot. I think it is, but I'm still messing with it. Let me know in the chat room if my mic's up too hot. Okay. So yeah, let's I guess get right into it. Messiah Matters is brought to you by TorahResource.com. TorahResource exists to provide biblically based education for disciples of Yeshua. And so normally I try to tell people about something that you can find free or whatever on TorahResource because there is a ton of free stuff. But tomorrow, Thursday, I will be starting a live series that will go up to Passover. It will be live on the TorahResource Facebook page, and it will be live on the Messiah Matters YouTube page. And I will do it every week leading up to Passover, so 5 weeks. And it will be titled "What Really Happened in Egypt." Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm part of a small group, and I've been writing notes for the small group on the 10 plagues that happened in Egypt. And I figured, well, they're already written. Why not share them with everybody else too? And so that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be reading those notes and kind of discussing some of the things on the live event. So 2:00 p.m. Pacific time, which would be 5 o'clock on the East Coast of the United States. Join me. It'll be fun. I think. I hope. I think it'll be good. I think people will learn something. At least we really hope so. And for those in the chat room, if you're in the chat room, Mr. Michael has just posted a link that you can ask for a reminder. So tomorrow it will let you know. And keep going back to the TorahResource Facebook page each week, and you can click the reminder, and it will let you know when we go live. All right. And Messiah Matters, that's this show, is also brought to you by the generous support of our listeners. Without the support of people, we would not be able to do this show, and we would not be able to run TorahResource, which is a full-time ministry. We have 5 full-time employees and 1 part-time employee. And so if you like this show, consider considering throwing a couple of bucks into the old offering box, if you know what I mean. You can do that by going to TorahResource.com and clicking on the donate button. And if you do that, let us know in the comments of your order that you're listening to Messiah Matters, because we actually really appreciate that. Okay, so what should we do first? I suppose we could do the listener question first, right? We got a listener question sent in to us by, I forget what his name was, and I actually cut it off in the beginning of this clip, but he left us something. Let's do that first, right? Let's tell everybody. I got 2 computers and 2 mouses. This is very confusing. Let's tell everybody how they can get a hold of us. You can give us a call on the comment line, which people have been doing, which is really fun and really nice. 253-465-3205. I'll give it to you again. It's 253-465-3205. You can also send us emails, chegg@TorahResource.com. That's chegg@TorahResource.com, CHEGG. All right. So with all that out of the way, so somebody sent this into our comment line, and this is what they said.
I got a question, though. So this regards to 1 Corinthians 10, and Paul makes a comment in there saying, if you go to get invited to a home of an unbeliever, then just eat whatever is offered to you, no matter without conscience. Now, my question is I know the context of meat offered to idols, but if it's an unbeliever, would they have ever offered them food that's not kosher? And then Paul's saying eat that too. But that seems contradictory, because I know Paul's not anti-Torah. So I just have had some Christian friends bring that up, and I was just curious if you guys could touch on that 1 Corinthians 10 passage. I appreciate it.
Okay, so he's talking about 1 Corinthians 10, 25 through 28. I'll read it for everyone. Reading out of the NASB. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. Okay, so the question is obviously, you go to an unbeliever's house and they put meat in front of you. Obviously, our caller knows that this is in the context of meat sacrificed to idols, and Paul it makes that obvious, right? It's very obvious in the context, and even in the passage I just read. If a person says to you, "This meat is meat sacrificed to idols," okay, so there's several points that I would make. First of all, we have this same kind of thing. There's been cults and whatnot that have tried to do evangelism through, I want to be careful in case there's little ears, but through prostitution and other things like that, right? This is not in other words, sinning in order to give the gospel is never acceptable, right? And is it a sin to eat pork? Yes, it is. Or unkosher food? Yes, it is. The Bible says we're not supposed to do that. But even more so, he says food. Mm. I think it's, I can't imagine any first century observant Jew of any Jewish sect associating unkosher food with food. In other words, a first century observant Jew, in my mind, would no more think of pork as food or shellfish as food as he would if his grandmother died and he decided, before we bury her, let's take a thigh. I mean, right? That's repulsive and disgusting, and no one would do it. And in the same way, unkosher food would be thought of the same way. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah. No, I agree. There's a couple things textually to talk about here. So, things sold in the marketplace, right? So I'm assuming that that they're saying, that Paul is saying, that the food sold, we're talking about meat here, right? We're not talking about vegetables. I think we're talking about animal meat, right?
Right.
I think we probably agree on that at least. That if it's being sold, particularly in this marketplace, in the Mahalan, that it probably that means it's not by definition meat that is being consumed as part of cultic gathering, right? Because he says you can't eat at a table of don't eat at a table of demons, right?
Right. But what does that mean?
You can't participate in a table of demons.
Yeah, we've talked about this before,
right?
And I think that means actually participating in the meal of a celebration to another god, right? In other words, you can't. Yeah.
And back to verse 28 then. Here's the thing. If an unbeliever inviting you, why is the unbeliever inviting you? Is my interpretation of this is someone who's interested, they respect what you're about. In other words, if an unbeliever invited Paul, it's not like Paul's just hanging out at the local pub and a guy comes up and says, "Hey,
you want dinner?
You look like a ball of fun. We're having a big get together. Why don't you just join us?" Right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who knows what you're about, right? And they respect it and they want to hear more. Right? If this meeting is not for the sake of the advancement of the gospel, then why are you going to go to someone you don't know who's not a believer and they just happen to invite you, but it's not for the advancement of Yeshua's message? I would question that. So I would say the presumption is in that if they know what you're about, they're probably going to be hospitable. And what that means is there's a general Mediterranean kind of culture, I believe, of hospitality. Sometimes that hospitality was like, "Hey, you invite me to your place, and then I'll expect, or you're going to expect me to invite you back, and we'll have this kind of reciprocal kind of family or communal kind of relationships." But this is something that's breaking that. This is out of the normal. This is an outsider inviting you. And I believe that these people are mission-minded, the Corinthian church here, and they're seeing this as an opportunity to expand the word, bring the word of Messiah to other people. And that's their core, that they're mission-minded. In other words, that's their core orientation. And so I think that's going to be up front, and it's going to be respected. Now, but he says then, if someone says to you in verse 28, this meat sacrificed to idols. This is an interesting word. It's not the normal word for meat sacrificed to idols. It's the hierathuton, which is sacrificed to a deity or to a temple. It's got the word hieros in it, like sacred. So technically the word idol is not here. The other one has the word idol in it. Idol slaughtered. This is like temple slaughtered. So that's just a textual footnote.
Well, something about that right there is that, if kosher food is an issue here, then why doesn't he say, somebody says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, or says this is unkosher food? He's worried about about what other people, what other believers would think when it comes to food sacrificed to idols. But you don't think that we should worry about what other believers would think in terms of kosher food? The idea that all of a sudden Christ dies on the cross and then the next day all of believing Judaism, all of the Messianics say, hey, you know what? Christ did away with the law. Let's not eat kosher anymore. Let's not celebrate the festivals. That's nonsense. That is simply not the way it happened. And so the idea that Paul would all of a sudden pull away from that is not only, there's no evidence of it, and we even see that there's evidence against it, right? Acts 21, when he goes to the temple to prove that he's not speaking against circumcision or keeping the law. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
One last point. He goes on to say, whatever you eat and drink, whatever you do to the glory of God. Then what does he say? Give no offense, either to Jews or to Greeks or to the ecclesia of Elohim. So, yeah, I think he's being gentle. Here's Paul talks this way in 1 Corinthians. He does the same thing when he's asking for money. He never comes out and asks for money. But he'll say, these guys blessed me, from Macedonia. And he's wants, back to Galatians, he's laboring for the Spirit of Messiah to take root and spring up in the lives of these people so that their worship of God, their love for their neighbor springs from is real genuine fruit of the Ruach in their life. And that the desire to walk in God's ways is not a compulsion from an external fear or threat, but that is literally the work of God in their hearts coming forth, producing fruit. That means it's their idea, right? That's what Paul is so gentle and careful because he knows what the compelling, that force culture is like, because that's what he grew up in. He grew up at the Pharisee. They were compelling people to be circumcised. They were forcing this, and under threat. So people's religious behavior, how do you know on the outside? It's if you have this kind of threat bully posse of zealous Jews, and everybody's afraid of them.
The Pharisees are coming. The Pharisees are coming.
Even Peter, we know that Peter's behavior shook in Antioch when the bullies from Jerusalem showed up. All of a sudden he's like, what do I do? What do I do? I got to change what I'm doing. Okay. He wants to eliminate this outer compulsion. And so his guidance needs to be understood in that regard. Because it's the terms, it's not even his own. He's not doing this because he's a clever teacher. He's doing it because he understands the terms of the new covenant. The terms of the Brit Hadashah is that God writes it on the heart. And so he'll say, I water, Apollo, or I plant, Apollos waters. God gives the increase. And Paul's going to say, if any increase that doesn't come from God working in the heart of believers, he's not interested in that. And so he's preparing the ground, he's getting rid of the rocks, he's pulling the weeds, but he's going to let God give the increase.
Right. Okay, good. I hope that answers the question satisfactorily. Yeah. Okay.
Good question. Yeah.
That was a good question. So, pardon me. In preparation for Passover. Now, in years past, I've always spent Passover with my parents, right? At my parents' house. My parents, it's a huge ordeal, right? I mean, Passover is by far my favorite holiday. American,
you mean as your family gets bigger, kind of thing?
Well, my parents have Passover has always been a big event for us, right? It was a huge dinner. The congregation that I'm a part of used to do a community Seder, and that was a big event too. The community put it on. Tickets were sold. We had it at the Officers Club at Fort Lewis back in the day, and it was fully catered. It was really very nice, but there was always something that went wrong. The crouton fiasco one year when the chef accidentally put croutons in the salad. I mean, these are the kind of things that, right?
It's like the fish is all, or whatever, the food's all sorted. They're like, we just discovered
exactly.
that this is lobster salad.
Exactly.
We
So
just discovered that it's real bacon.
yeah. So basically,
that's comical. That's what that is.
The leadership at the Gary in the chat room memories. Leadership of the community.
You gotta love it. You gotta love it.
It's all part of being in community. Leadership decided that we should do home seders, and everybody was happy to do that, I think. And so now the congregation is basically, if you don't have somewhere to go, you put your name on a list, and then there's just tons of houses that host seders, and depending on, I wonder if I have it here. Somebody in our community produced this. It's this little booklet. It's a Haggadah. And, it's pretty standard, pretty traditional. Yeshua's kind of put as center in there. My family always just used an Orthodox Haggadah. And for those who don't know, a Haggadah is the order of service for a Passover Seder. This is the one that my family used for years. I think that they're actually moving away from this now. Anyway, my mom has like 20, 23 people, something like that at her house for Passover. Wow. Yeah, it's a lot of people. And, we started a small group, and our small group, nobody had anywhere to go for Passover. And so my wife and I decided, well, let's do Passover at our house. So that's what we decided to do. I think we have about 20 people coming to our house, which our house is not equipped. It is not big enough to have 20 people in it for any kind of party, but we're going to do it anyway. Not the point. So me and a couple other people decided, hey, you know what? Actually, Adam Smith is one of them. We decided, hey, let's not just do a traditional Haggadah. And as I've been studying the Passover, as I've been studying the Last Supper, I started to realize in my studies that a lot of what I used to, the preconceived notions or the notions that I had about the Last Supper and what Yeshua was doing was not in fact, how should I say this? Maybe it was taken as tradition after the first century and wasn't necessarily set tradition in the first century. Let me explain what I mean. Okay. For instance, I've found a couple of books that will tell you, okay, in Luke 22, it seems like Yeshua has two cups, right? There's the first cup, right? And then he breaks bread, and then there's a second cup. And so the question, why is there two cups in Luke, but there's only one cup in the other synoptic gospels? Right. And a lot of, especially Messianics, right? Especially Messianics, what they'll do is that, but not just Messianics, Darrell Bach is a person who puts forward this idea. The idea is that, there's four cups in the Passover Haggadah. There's four traditional cups, ceremonial cups that you drink during the Passover celebration. And this was either two of the four cups, or it was an infant stage of the four cups. So that's, and so we see the Haggadah already in the first century. And I think that a lot of people, my father's written this before as well, and he's going to have to go back and change this now. But the fact of the matter is that no, more than likely what was going on is that the Mishnah, written 250, 300 years later, is now incorporating customs from the Greco-Roman banquets into the Mishnah. And this was a huge shocker to me. The idea that every time we would recline at table at the, we're supposed to lean on one arm during the Passover Seder. We just thought, this is what Yeshua was doing because it was part of the Passover Seder. Well, no, laying down during meals was something that we see throughout the Gospels, not just at Passover. And come to find out, triclinium were three-sided banquet seating that was not seating, it was laying down. And that was very common in Greco-Roman. It had nothing to do with Passover. It was just Greco-Roman banquets in general. That's what they did. And so this was not part of a Passover tradition in the first century. All these kind of things, the idea that Yeshua dips in the Gospels. Once again, this most likely had nothing to do with dipping bitter herbs at the Passover meal. That was much later incorporated into the Haggadah. And so all these kind of revelations, as I've been studying the Passover and studying the Last Supper, have really kind of jolted my understanding of the Haggadah. And so the small group that I'm a part of, we decided, you know what, why don't we make our own Haggadah? And so that's what I've been doing for the past 2 days. I sat down and I decided to put together my own Haggadah. And in total, it's 22 pages, which is nothing compared to, I think this one is probably, 100 at least? Yeah, 100 pages.
We're going to sit down and read a 100-page book over dinner tonight.
Yeah, that's what happens.
That's a lot, yeah.
Well, we wanted so in my small group, and I know this really doesn't have to do with what we're talking about, but in my small group, we have small kids, and we wanted the first portion to be anywhere from, less than 45 minutes, 45 minutes or less. And so then the question is, okay, well, what do you take out that's not going to tick everybody off? Some people are used to the traditional Haggadah. They're expecting 4 cups. They're expecting, the 4 different kinds of children. And as you start to study some of these scholars, like Israel Yuval, who's a Jewish scholar, he shows that some very interesting things. He shows that that there's a possibility that the 4th child is actually a slam against Christians. In other words, this is being formed after the destruction of the temple, and now they're responding to Christianity. And basically, Ernest says, a great idea, Caleb. I want a copy. If you would like a copy of the Haggadah that I have created, hey, let me hang on just a sec. Let me mute myself real quick. Then I would be happy to give you a copy of it. However, I should say that it is going to deviate quite extensively from what people might be used to in a Passover Haggadah. Email me. I would be happy to give you one, chag@TorahResource.com. Okay. So one of the things that I found to be very interesting, and jump in here at any time, Rob, because, I know I've been talking now for a long time, trying to set this up a little bit. One of the things that I thought was extremely interesting was the idea of the Afikomen. Now, when we sit down at table, we have the matzah there, and if you're in a Messianic home, you're always going to hear, look at the matzah. It's striped, it's pierced, just like the Messiah was striped and pierced, right? And for the anti-missionaries, the non-believing Jews, they'll say, oh, the Christians, we've been making matzah like that forever. It has nothing to do with Christ. It has nothing to do. They're just putting meaning into whatever. Well, then there's the question of Afikomen, and the actually, let me get it out here. This was so interesting to me, and I kind of went down this rabbit trail yesterday, and started looking for proof of this, and actually, there's some pretty good proof of this. Okay, I'm going to read just a little bit out of Israel Yuval's work here. If I can, sorry. Give me just a second. If I had some music, I would. How do I rotate this? Rotate right. Okay, there we go. And okay, the assumption. This is from Israel Yuval's article. A reference to this can be found also in your show notes for those who get the show notes. The assumption that the Haggadah was composed in part with an eye to excluding Christian heretics explains also the image of the wicked son in the 4 sons narrative. Our Haggadah presents the wicked son as asking, what does this service mean to you? By throwing into question the laws and commandments, say our text, he excludes himself from the community and denies the foundation of our faith. A description that suits the Jewish Christian very well. We therefore see, keep in mind, by the way, that this is Israel Yuval, who is not a believer. I'm correct in that, right? Israel Yuval's a Jewish scholar, right?
Yeah, at Hebrew University, he's a scholar of Jewish history.
I can't imagine the flack he got on writing this. Anyway, we therefore see a new meaning to the answer that is assigned to the wise son, or to the foolish son, according to the Yerushalmi. It cites Mishnah Pesakim 10:8. And then he, Ein Mafterin Achar HaPesach Afikomen. Sorry, he transliterated it instead of giving you the real Hebrew.
Oh, yeah.
And
That's from the Mishnah.
Right.
It says they don't finish the Passover with Afikomen. And this Afikomen is not a word used anywhere in the Mishnah or other early rabbinic works. It's a Greek word, right? I mean, that's the argument that Yuval is going. This is not a Hebrew term, right?
Right.
It's a Greek.
It's a Greek term.
Word.
Yeah.
Now that's not so sensational in itself. There's hundreds and hundreds. There's like at least probably 400, I think, Greek words peppered throughout the Mishnah itself.
Right.
So the presence of a Greek or Latin word in the Mishnah. Now, of course, it's spelled in Hebrew letters. I mean, but that's in itself not what is of note here. What's of note here is that this is its only appearance, and there are others that only appear once too. So, but that what's it doing? What's this Greek term doing in the description of the Passover meal, of what's not acceptable, right, in terms of the Mishnah? This is something that's they're saying is not acceptable.
Right. Okay. So he goes on. So basically, the question is, Mishnah Pesakim 10:8. What does this mean? One may not conclude the Paschal lamb or the Passover with Afikomen, which is interesting because how do you conclude the Passover? You find the Afikomen and that's the last thing you eat, right? That's what you conclude with. So what does the Mishnah mean by this? And Yuval goes on. In order to understand this cryptic remark, we must observe how Melito used the word. This is Melito of Sardis. How Melito used the word Aphikomenos, meaning coming, in order to describe the incarnation and passion of Jesus. It is he who is coming from heaven to earth. Melito describes the Afikomen of Yeshua immediately after this sermon about the Passover being symbol for him, thus completing his symbolic treatment of the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, paralleling the sermon of Rabban Gamliel. In other words, so then what I did was I started looking into, okay, first of all, when is Melito of Sardis? And the answer is he wrote on Pascha in 170. So this is long before the Mishnah comes out, right? Yeah. So basically the first, and if you go to any Jewish website, they're going to tell you that the first reference that we have to the Afikomen is in the Mishnah. That is not true. The first reference we have of the Afikomen is associated with Yeshua by Melito of Sardis. What's interesting to me is that as we start to look at Judaism through the ages, I think that what can be observed, I personally believe this, and people can challenge me on this, but I think that what Judaism oftentimes does is if something is becoming prevalent, not in Judaism, but is becoming prevalent in the surrounding culture, they take it and they say they had it first. We can see this in modern Judaism, right? In modern Judaism, the idea of the tzaddik. Well, the whole theology of the tzaddik is essentially Christianity. It's the theology of what Yeshua does in the heavenly tabernacle, just put on their own rabbis. They didn't make anything new up. They took something that was becoming very, very prevalent within Christianity around them.
There's another example of this that's aside is Josephus tells the story of Vespasian and how Vespasian came and I think it was Josephus himself, told Vespasian that he would be emperor of Rome, and then it came true, right? And there's a little story here. Then later in rabbinic world, the story's told as it's Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is in a besieged Jerusalem. They get him out of the city, and he meets Vespasian, and he tells him, "You're going to be at Rome." I mean, there's all these elements that it's the same story, but the names were changed to bring like honor and legitimacy to the rabbinic genealogy of sages, rather than, and Josephus is wiped out of it. So you encounter that, and you're like, well, Josephus is earlier. We know about his historical situation. And then we know the later rabbis are retelling the stories. And it's an example. So this is not, it's not strange that, and this is what happens with oral tradition. Oral tradition, the big important elements get transmitted, but the names and things will change to fit the audience at the new historical moment. So, in any event.
Anyway,
so
what
you're saying is that Melito used this term, and it probably had some what the argument is, this Greek term concerning Yeshua relating to the Passover, and it had distribution right beyond Melito's book. Right, there were probably Christians that thought in these terms and probably were interacting with Jews in the Holy Land, for example, and then the rabbis had to respond to it.
I think
they had to make sure.
I think it's even more than that, though.
Okay.
Because I think what you have, Rob sent me some questions that he thought would be good to look at leading up to Passover. These are also in your show notes. Let's see here. The first one. How or when did the Lord's Supper become disassociated from Pesach or Passover? And the second one, how and when did Easter become separated from Passover? So both these questions, in my mind, happen right around the same time. Now, you do start to see this this parting, okay? And by the mid-2nd century, you have people talking about beginning to talk about the institution of Passover. And right around this same time, there's actually a lot historically that's going on at this time in terms of this. But we know from Eusebius that the Jerusalem church or ecclesia of believers was still celebrating Passover. And Polycarp gets up, Polycarp is talking about how he had Passover with the Apostle John, and this is where the whole Cuatro controversy comes from. The Cuatro controversy, I think, has been misunderstood by many scholars. There are a couple of scholars who I think have finally started to get it right, but the idea was not whether or not you fast on Nisan 14 or Nisan 15, or if you do it on Easter. That was not in my opinion, that was not the controversy. However, it did spark the church infighting. I use church as the ecclesia, the believers infighting. And this is really where Rome decides, they have these debates and whatnot, and finally they decide that they're going to fix the celebration of the resurrection of Christ on a Sunday, and it's not going to coincide with Passover. And the reason it's not going to coincide with Passover is because they don't want, you have this debate going on within the church fathers too, whether or not, okay, now that Christ has died on the cross, is it just that we don't have to celebrate? We don't have to keep the Torah anymore? Or is that we shouldn't keep the Torah anymore? And this is a debate that's actually going on. The debate over Passover and Easter is really one of the deciding factors in this. And the church decides, okay, we're going to have it on a Sunday, and it's not going to coincide with the Passover. Now, it can be during the Passover, but it's not going to coincide with Nisan 14. And so this is where you get the fixed date of Easter in the church, in the Western church. Now, and interestingly, they say they send something to the church in Jerusalem, to the believers in Jerusalem. They say, stop celebrating the Passover. We'll send you something different instead. What is it that they sent them instead? It's a very interesting, something that a lot of people have not picked up on. I think that they sent them what they thought was now a established, instituted Holy Eucharist. When I say Eucharist, I mean communion. And this is different than the meals that they were having before, the agape meals and other things. This is now a set communion. That's what I believe. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we have to kind of connect dots between the Last Supper that we read about at the end of the Gospels, Synoptics, and then what you're talking about in the 4th, 5th century, and say, okay, well, how did we get from point A to point B? And I think that we have evidence that shows believers in Yeshua, at least a stream or two of them, continued to keep a Nisan 14 Passover. And we don't have any reason to think that they did not rehearse the text traditions, such as we find in Luke or in 1 Corinthians 11, as part of their meal. In other words, I just think to imagine a Nisan 14 Passover celebration by believers anywhere in the 1st through 2nd and 3rd centuries that did not rehearse Yeshua as the Pascha, right?
Right.
As the Pesach lamb, as the new covenant. What's the new covenant about? What is the forgiveness of sin? And proclaiming his death, like Paul says, proclaiming his death until he comes. That there's an anticipation of redemption, ultimate redemption, that is built into the story of the meal. In other words, you have a rehearsed group solidarity story that's being rehearsed, and that's where people see it's their highest value.
I agree.
They're rehearsing and discussing and meditating upon their highest values that they have, and that's going to have echoes out to other Jewish groups that are going, oh, well, so should I do it that way, or am I part of that story or not? Right.
So one of the things that I should stress is that in the 1st century, we don't have any evidence that there was a set Passover tradition. Each community had different tradition. And as the Christians now are centering in on Yeshua as the Passover lamb and associating all these things with Yeshua, they're starting to have set tradition. We see this already in like 60, 70 when Luke writes, because there's liturgical tradition that we see within his story. Do this in remembrance of me. Paul has the same thing in 1 Corinthians 11. And so Christians or believers or whatever you want to title them, were celebrating Passover all the way up until the second half of the 2nd century. And when the Mishnah is written, it's what I think happens is now they are taking pieces of what the Christians have already done and pieces of what they've done, but now they're solidifying it and they're saying we had it first. They're trying to disassociate it from Christianity. I want to go back real quick to what is being said in the chat room. This is a good comment from Gary. He says, while I appreciate the scholarly approach to this discussion, I'm also concerned that it disempowers people. Let me explain. As we approach Passover, I would like to see more host a Seder in their own homes. I think that this is actually more what is going on in the Passover text than, and we see this even in the 1st century, than having group Seders. In other words, you were supposed to have a lamb for every 10 people, essentially, or and if there weren't enough people in your home, you were supposed to have your neighbor, right? And then even in Yeshua's time, you go to the temple, you have it slaughtered. Where do you go? You take it back to the house. You don't, it's not one huge group event. Each person has a Seder in their own home, and I think that this is really more how it was set up to be, which means someone is going to have to take the lead. I agree. A Haggadah rewrite is within that any leader's prerogative. Is within any leader's prerogative, I think is what he meant. But most people are afraid of doing something wrong, so they are less likely to even do it at all. Am I making sense? Yes, and I agree. I think this should be said straight away about Passover. What is, and we've talked, I think we said this last week too, what is required at Passover to keep the Passover? I have identified what I think are the three main things. There are some other things, right? You're supposed to have the lamb roasted in bitter herbs. You're supposed to eat matzah, and you're supposed to observe the 2 Sabbaths that are associated with Passover. We could also add in there that you are required to eat bitter herbs with matzah. However, I think that's a technical issue. We could talk about that. So if that is the case, we can have bitter herbs, we can have matzah, we can rest on the Shabbat. So what are we missing? The only other thing we're missing is the lamb. But as believers in the Messiah Yeshua, we're not missing the lamb. The lamb is present at our table. Yeshua is the Passover lamb. Paul tells us that, right? And Yeshua is with us at our Passover table. He says, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So our Passover lamb is physically present at our table. And beyond that, his blood has been spilled against the altar in the heavenly places. We as believers are able to fulfill the Passover completely. Unbelieving Jews, it's like a curse. They can't celebrate the Passover fully. So the point is that beyond that, you can do whatever you want. If you want to have 4 cups, have 4 cups. If you don't want to have 4 cups, don't have 4 cups. In the thing that I just wrote, we have 2 cups, one at the beginning of the meal and one at the beginning of after the meal's over. We say we have another cup. But that's because that's what I see in Luke. So there's a lot of wiggle room. Basically, it's up to what we want. If we would just want to bow our heads and pray and say, "Lord, this is the Passover that you have commanded," and we do it in honor of our Messiah Yeshua, guess what? Fulfilled. That is my understanding of it. Your thoughts, Rob?
Well, what's the alternative? The alternative view is, I was just talking to somebody the other day who had knew of a Messianic community that has basically gone to look at only Jewish sources because under the idea that the rabbis preserve the traditions as God wants them. Right. And if you take that approach, if that's your filtration system, then why would you even you're not going to have any mention of Yeshua in the meal, right? If you go with the traditional Passover Seder, you're not going to have any mention of Yeshua or his suffering and death, the gospel. There is no declaration of his death until he comes, as Paul says. There's no mention of the Brit Hadashah and the forgiveness of sins, right? You don't have any of that stuff. And so what we're talking about kind of is a scale, right, where those are the extreme end points, and that people are going to be somewhere in between, where they're drawing on tradition that has much beautiful practice and can be very meaningful and has a lot of scripture in it. And so they're going to come down on that scale somewhere between those extremes. And I think as we grow and learn and mature, I think we'll probably change a little bit. Just like you shared, Caleb, you shared a little bit of your own history and kind of how you've moved, that needle has moved a little bit on that continuum. Right. But we're definitely kind of asserting, that believers in Yeshua have very specific things that are part of the Passover, the Pesach celebration. And that it's hard to imagine a believer in Yeshua participating in a Pesach that either it's forbidden or it just is not mentioned at all. Nothing of the gospel is mentioned at all. That's like, to be like, wow, okay, what are you doing? Are you playing religion? What's the meaning for you?
Right.
In other words, do we have meaning? Is it possible? Here's another way to ask the question. Is it possible for believers in Yeshua to think about Passover without Yeshua, apart from Yeshua? I mean, is there spiritual profit or benefit from that?
So
it seems like that for the apostles and Paul, they thought of Yeshua and Pesach as inextricably forever bound together in historical events, and then the meaning and spiritual and ultimate redemptive implications of those events, right? There's no going back.
Right. There is a comment that I would like to address in the chat room. Someone says, I am of the opinion that there should be more separation between Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Somebody says, what do you mean? She says, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is after the day of Passover. Are they not separate commands? So
that's good. Petrie gets into that in defining what is Pascha. Go ahead, Caleb.
Right. Oh, well, no, I was just going to say that this is, I understand why that could be argued from the Torah text, because it seems like there is something that said, the Passover, and then it seems like the Feast of Unleavened Bread is talked about separately, or it could be interpreted that way. However, by the time we come to the first century, Yeshua and the disciples certainly do not separate the two. In fact, they 100% associate the two together as one festival. They say, I believe it's Luke says, and the Pascha was coming, which is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, in other words, they're interchanging the word Pascha.
Yeah, the Pascha has some flexibility. That's
right.
Our Dr. Brant Petrie interview covers, I think, some of the different usages. But one of the meanings, and that's a good question, because one of the meanings of Pascha is just the meal, right? It could be the lamb specifically. It could be the specific meal that's at the end of the 14th, transitioning into the 15th.
So another question. See, the thing about the Passover and celebrating Passover, there are so many questions. Peter says, my understanding is that the Passover is the sacrifice, but can be used in context interchangeably as the whole week, the prep day before the first holiday, etc. Maybe Rob elaborate. There is Dr. Petrie in his book, which is fantastic, by the way. I know that he's Roman Catholic, but his work on the chronology of the Passion is right in line with what my father wrote as well. And so he identifies 4 Passover, like 4 definitions for the word Passover or Pascha. In what I've been writing, I try to identify a fifth one. And anyway, yeah. So yes, there are 4. I believe that there are 4 or 5 definitions for the word Pascha. Whether or not the 14th, I don't think the 14th is necessarily, that's debatable. That is debatable, whether or not the 14th is included in the word Pascha.
Here's one way that we could understand it by using a biblical term. The word is chag, which is the word for feast. And if we just look at the book of Exodus 12:14, it says, "You shall celebrate this as this day shall be a zikaron, a memorial." And then it says a chag ladonai, a feast, a permanent or a hukat olam. This is Exodus 12:14. It's talking about the Passover rite, right? This is eating the meal. This is Exodus 12. It says, Hayom hazeh, this day, But then in 13, Exodus 13:6, it says Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot. So 7 days you will eat matzot. Uvayom Hashvi'i Chag LaAdonai. And on the 7th day, Chag LaAdonai. So you have Chag for Hayom Hazeh, it says in 12:14. Chag for Hayom Hashvi'i, the 7th day in 13:6. And then Exodus 23:15. Et Chag HaMatzot Tishmoru Shivat Yamim. That means the Chag of Matzot you will keep for 7 days. So we have Chag. This is just, we're not even looking at translations. We're not looking at different books of the Bible. We're looking just at the book of Shemot and the use of Chag to distinguish the Passover, right? The 7th day. And then it's called Chag HaMatzot, the whole thing. So the word Chag even has unique application in these different contexts. It's all generally under the big umbrella talking about this spring feast, right? But it's using it specifically for the first day, for the 7th day, and then for all 7 days. So words can have this flexibility, and that's an important aspect of our hermeneutic, right? That we understand we need to look at context and understand that words have flexibility. They have semantic ranges, and comparing Scripture with Scripture will help us kind of see and get a sense of those semantic ranges.
So should we even try to do another? I know we're coming down to...
I got a book review. We could wrap up with my book review.
Yeah, do a book review. Let's hear it.
I'm glad I chose this book, because when I chose this book, I was not thinking about I was just, honestly, I was like, oh, I forgot I have a book review today. And I was just going through my, looking and grabbed a book. This book was written in its English translation is 1995, written in Hebrew by Menachem Hirschman, who goes by Mark Hirschman, M-A-R-C. He's a professor he's been at a couple Hebrew University, at a couple Israeli institutions. It's called A Rivalry of Genius, Jewish and Christian Biblical Interpretation in Late Antiquity, translated from Hebrew by Batya Stein. So I'll hold this up here. Now, this is out of print. It was originally printed by SUNY, S-U-N-Y, which is State University of New York, in 1995. However, it's available on Google Play. They have a free sample you can download. It's called Rivalry of Genius. And Google Play, you can purchase it for $17 ebook. I say, if you're interested in what we talked about today, if you're interested in the larger interaction in what Hirschman's calling late antiquity, that's post-destruction of the temple, but up to the rise of Islam, right? We're talking about several hundred years there between the destruction of the temple and the rise of Islam. And looking at what he calls a rivalry, and he calls it a rivalry of genius, is the competition for interpreting the Bible on Jewish sides and rabbinic sides. And so just as an example, he compares rabbinic texts with contemporary church father texts. For example, one chapter is he looks at Justin Martyr and the dialogue with Trypho, right? So that's pretty early. But then he looks at Genesis Rabbah and kind of compares those. And then he looks at excerpts from dialogue with Trypho from the Mechilta, which is Mechilta Rabbi Ishmael. Here's one that fits in our topic. Chapter 7 is Passover and the Exodus in Origen's writings on one hand and in the rabbinic midrashim on the other. So what Hirschman is doing, what's so important, is to understand that when we read rabbinic midrash, we don't want to just read the midrash and say, oh, this must be background to the stories of Jesus. No, that's what we call anachronism. What Hirschman is doing is saying, no, you got to look at contemporary, it's like newspapers, right? If I look at a newspaper article in the New York Times from 1980, I'm not going to compare that with a book written 100 years prior. right? I want to look at similar reports from the same time frame.
Right.
That's what he's doing. And so he's gathering somewhat contemporary sources in late antiquity, Christian on one side, Jewish on the other, and comparing them and showing how are they interacting with the same ideas, and are they disputing how to interpret the shared ideas, or are they completely in different worlds? What he's going to show is, he talks about the rivalry. The idea is that there is knowledge there, especially in the land of Israel, where you've got Christians and Jews in that time, in Byzantine era, that you have ideas that are traveling back and forth. So anyway, Rivalry of Genius available. It's out of print. You might find a used copy, but it is available digitally through Google Play.
So before we go, I want to answer
it's
one last.
It's a buy or a borrow.
A buy or a borrow. Thank you. Before we go, I want to answer one last question from the chat room. Drew asks, Caleb and Rob, what date do you celebrate Passover? So I celebrate what I believe Yeshua did, and that is, and what I believe the Torah recommends, which is that basically we get the unleavened bread out of our house on the 14th, by or on the morning of the 14th. It is not a Sabbath on the 14th, obviously, and people are able to buy and sell. We see this even in the apostolic writings when Judas stands up to go somewhere, and the disciples think that he's going to buy something before the festival starts. Once the sun goes down on the 14th, it is now the 15th of Nisan, which is a Sabbath. And that is Passover, and I think that the actual Exodus Passover, the slaying of the firstborn, happened around midnight on the night of the 15th. That is 14th turning into 15th. Sun goes down. It's midnight of the 15th, and the Passover happens. And I think that is now the Sabbath. And so our Seder is on the night of the 14th. We try to start usually in the daytime before the sun is down, as I believe Yeshua did, and I think that is also provable. And then into the night, just like the Torah prescribes, and of course, then Shabbat on the 15th. That's when I sell. And then, of course, you cannot disassociate the Passover. It is my personal belief that you cannot disassociate the Passover. And actually, going back to the idea that you can separate Passover from unleavened bread, once again, this doesn't work either, as there are continued Passover sacrifices, which are called the Pascha, even in Tanakh, right, yeah, that go all the way through the 7 days. So in the Tanakh, the word Pascha can refer to either the first sacrifice on Nisan 14 of the lamb / goat, depending on what you, or can refer to the shlamim offerings that are sacrificed throughout the week of Passover. And therefore, the idea that you can separate Passover from unleavened bread, I don't think works, not only in the apostolic scriptures, but I think there is proof within the Torah or within the Tanakh itself that these two are not separated, that they are one and the same, a festival. And if you would like to know more about that, you can read either my father's second volume of his commentary, second or fourth, maybe it's his fourth volume of his commentary on the book of Matthew, or you can also read his there's a chronology of the Passion in the TorahResource articles for free, and he lays it out there. You could also get Dr. Brant Peatrey's book on the Last Supper, or you can wait until I publish. All right. Hey, it's been a fun conversation. We hope everyone has a wonderful Purim, because, it's a time to be joyous, right? We love it. Write us, chag@TorahResource.com. That's chag@TorahResource.com. 253-465-3205. Give us a call. We're just trying to do one thing, that's glorify our great God and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah, because Messiah matters.